Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Well, hello and welcome back to Footnotes. Footnotes is our Fellowship Mosaic podcast where we just go further into discussions that were launched from the sermon on Saturday night. And so this past Saturday, Scott Jones taught us about the rhythm of Sabbath. We're in this rhythm series right now where we're talking about what are those regular practices that we can participate in that help us to grow into Christ-likeness, to be more like Jesus. And as Scott was talking about the idea of Sabbath and rest, this was his kind of big concrete idea for us to take away that I thought was so well worded. He said, a restless heart will lead to a reckless life, but a reverent heart will lead to rest. And so I thought we'd just kind of start there. I'm Nick, by the way, and I'm sitting here with Collin Jackson and Scott Jones. Hey, guys.
Hey, Nick. Hey.
How are we doing?
Collin, you have to say hi when I say hi.
What was your definition again?
He said a restless heart leads to a reckless life, but a reverent heart leads to a restful life.
That's good.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I wanted to talk about that reverence for a minute, Nick, because if we're going to seek to have a life of rest, then that means we need to seek a life or a heart that is reverent for the Lord and His holiness. I talked about Exodus 20, a pretty good amount on Saturday, just the 10 Commandments and Moses giving those to the people of Israel. And when he gave them the commandment about keeping the Sabbath day holy, his reasoning was, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day when he created the world, and he made it holy. So keep the Sabbath day because the Lord has blessed it. And it seemed to just be regarding God's creation and God's intent for creation, because God has done this, because God has called this day holy, keep it in honor of him. But in Deuteronomy 5, right on the edge of the promised land, before the Israelites are entering in and the 10 Commandments are delivered again, the reasoning for keeping the Sabbath day holy, it says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. I think there seems to be in that Deuteronomy 5 passage a lot of reverence for who God is and what he's done. Because God has brought victory into your life that you do not deserve, by his mighty hand, honor him by keeping the Sabbath day holy. And so I'm just really reading that Deuteronomy 5 passage. I'm really inspired to want to keep the Sabbath day holy because I have a legitimate reverence in my heart for God and his holiness. The things he's done, the way he's been faithful, how he's been so good to keep his promises, how he's been mighty, the miracles that I've seen, the stories of miraculous healing or whatever, just the things that God has done and who he's been. So I want to start off just talking about reverence for that type of majesty, kind of like being an Israelite who wants to keep the Sabbath day holy because we remember what he did in Egypt and bringing us out of Egypt. What would it be like for us to have that type of excitement or reverence for God and his holiness and his majesty that would ultimately lead us to rhythms of rest too? But Nick, can you speak into that reverence piece? What might it look like to have a rhythm of reverence in our lives?
Yeah, I think the thing that's so helpful about that definition where you've taken us is, that idea of the purpose of developing reverence for God is really the purpose of the entire Old Testament law. Like, if you think about their food laws of clean and unclean, that wasn't because certain animals were actually dirty and others were clean. That's what Jesus is later going to say in the book of Acts, is don't call it unclean if I made it clean. The point was, it was a teaching illustration. By ordering their lives around certain kinds of food, certain kinds of rhythms of day and time and space, all of it was this giant, I like the word pageant, like this giant enacted illustration that God is holy. He is different. He is set apart. And so all of those rhythms are made to teach us something. And I think one of the most helpful, insightful moments around that transition from the Old Testament period of experiencing God's holiness to the New Testament comes in John chapter 4, when John has a conversation with a Samaritan woman, and she asks him about sacred space. So they had set, the temple in Jerusalem was set apart as the sacred space to meet God. And they knew if you want to meet God, you have to get to the temple. That's where you meet God. And so she, as a Samaritan who didn't go to Jerusalem, couldn't go to Jerusalem, they had their own sacred space, they thought, in Samaria. She's asking Jesus, well, where do we meet God? Samaria or Jerusalem? And Jesus says to her that there is a day coming when it's neither in Jerusalem nor in Samaria that you'll go to worship God, but true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth. And he says, but salvation does come from the Jews. And so what he says is, it is in the law. It was via God's people Israel that you would meet this holy God. So he doesn't destroy all those rules that were in the Old Testament. He shows their purpose of bringing us to God and meeting the one true holy God. But he says going forward, it's no longer going to be the case that teaching illustration of bringing people to Jerusalem to understand a holy God will have served its purpose. So from now on, once they met Jesus, the one in whom heaven and earth meet, and the incarnate Son of God, you don't need a temple in Jerusalem anymore. So sacred space is no longer designated by a temple in Jerusalem. So that's why we can worship on Pleasant Grove Road. We don't have to go to Jerusalem. Yeah. However, that doesn't mean suddenly that because we don't have a temple anymore, space doesn't matter. Well, no, when you look in the book of Acts, they still designate spaces to worship. Yeah. They still say, we're going to gather at this home. We're going to gather at this place. Because practically, humans need space for worship to take place. And so the difference is that space no longer has to be sanctified with holy water or designated. It's just it is the practical place that we set apart for worship. And I think that idea of sacred place can translate to time. Yeah. It's no longer the case that Sabbath has to take place on this designated hour to this designated hour on the week. That was a teaching point to teach us the value of revering God's holiness. Yeah. But practically, we still have to set aside time to do that. If we are going to grow in reverence for God, we're going to have to set aside some time to do that. So part of what we do that for is our worship hour. You know, we say, hey, we're going to set aside this hour to get together and worship. And there's also saints throughout the ages have recognized there is still practical value in carving out space that is dedicated for reverence. Yeah. Whether that be the date, what we, in our kind of evangelical circles call the quiet time. So we might designate some time in the morning saying this space is set aside to stop and revere the Lord. Many people still, my family does, see the value in going, and we're also going to designate a day. Yeah. And so we're going to designate a day to say we're going to stop and revere the Lord. And I also love that you said this. It's a feast day, not a fast day. Yeah. So that means part of our revering the Lord is enjoying food and fun together. That's part of our Sabbath day. So for our family, we do that Friday night at 5:00 leading up to the start of Mosaic on Saturday night. That's when we have our Sabbath time. Is we get home from school, we do like 2 hours of Sabbath. We call it Sabbath prep. So from like 3 to 5, it's like clean the house, set aside any food we need, make sure we're ready for Sabbath. And then we rest and we revere the Lord together. So I think the idea of the need for setting aside special time to pursue the Lord didn't go away. Yeah. What went away was the set structure of it has to be at this time.
So Nick, there's a lot of, even today, if you start talking about this and diving into this, it seems like there's a lot of disagreements. So we might hear things like, okay, first and foremost, Jesus abolished the law. Like we don't have to practice anything from the Old Testament anymore. Like that's something people might say, and some correction might need to be done there. The certain day, the time, the period, it has to be here, it has to be there. Catholic early creed changed it to this time and day, and the reason for it, and there's a lot of debate, it seems, around this idea, even meaning. Is Jesus the Sabbath? Is he the rest? Is it what wisdom would you give to if I'm sitting here and I hear you and then I start doing some research and I'm like, wow, it seems like there's a lot of debate about this topic. Any insights?
I love the word you said, which was wisdom. And I think that's what we experience from Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, is the growing into maturity of wisdom. When you are young and learning something, you need preset forms. So y'all remember learning to write, and you had the alphabet pad that had the little dotted letters that you traced?
So good.
That's what you have to do to learn to write, is you need a form to trace. And in the Old Testament, God gave Israel a form to trace for holy living. Everything was like just drawn out for them. This is how you structure your week. This is how you structure your year. This is how your diet is structured. This is how your services are structured. Everything was really structured to teach Israel a rhythm. Yeah. When we mature from kindergarten writing to older writing, we don't go, cool, I'll leave the alphabet behind now. Mm-hmm. It'd be nonsense. Mm-hmm. You still need an alphabet to write. You just don't need the pre-structured forms anymore. You learn to do it intuitively. You now can use that alphabet. Yeah. So I would say the principles of setting aside space and time to meet with the Lord didn't go away. And you see that because the New Testament church still did that. Yeah. They still gathered on the Lord's Day for a day of worship and prayer. Temple. Yeah. What they didn't do is have a whole lot of Sabbath laws that governed them. And so I would say we're in a season where the people of God, I would say, because we have the person of Jesus and the indwelling Holy Spirit, we're in as a group, a more mature season of being able to have some flexibility in how we pursue the principles of the Old Testament that did not go away. So that's why Jesus said he didn't come to abolish the law, he came to fulfill it. It's like you've graduated from grammar school, and now you can start writing. Yeah, you can start living this out with some wisdom and flexibility is how I understand that relationship.
So is there a little bit of a J-curve in all of this? You know, if you're inspired by the Old Testament rhythms and laws around the Sabbath, and also inspired by the things that Christ has said regarding our ability to worship in spirit and in truth, the rhythms that the church has regarding the holiness of the Lord and walking in the precepts of his kingdom and things, is there, in taking those things seriously, is there a little bit of a J-curve where you find yourself maybe feeling worse at it before you really feel better? Maybe kind of going downhill and like, man, as I'm trying to do this thing, I'm actually realizing I really am bad at this thing, and I actually don't feel like it's helping a lot, and I actually feel kind of down about the fact that I really don't feel very holy or very close to the Lord, and then maybe find yourself growing in such a way that you never would have if you wouldn't have tried.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like taking the training wheels off a bike. I think training wheels are a really good metaphor for the Old Testament law. They were there so you could learn the mechanics of writing, and when you first take the training wheels off, you're going to crash a lot. Yeah, I got a lot of skinned knees learning to ride my bike without the training wheels, and so that makes perfect sense. Like legalism is easier, right? Like to go if we could just prescribe for a church all the rules. Everybody, we are doing Sabbath this way at this time every week, and these are all the things you're not going to do. That's easier. But it's also less fulfilling and mature than having the flexibility of wisdom to pursue that. Yes. And yes, absolutely. When you are trying to structure your life in rhythms of grace and walking with the Lord, it's going to be hard. I'm still terrible at a lot of it. There's certain rhythms that work well for me, and there's certain ones that I just feel like I'm floundering daily in. And by floundering daily, that means like not practicing them for long stretches at all. Yeah. And then when I practice them, I feel like they're not like, I'm not having aha moments. I'm not having these amazing times of intimacy with the Lord. And so, absolutely. I think that there certainly is a difficulty that comes with stepping into some of the freedom and maturity that comes with New Covenant life in the Spirit.
If rhythms of reverence, and these rhythms of reverence can be carved out, and there, time and spaces and places, in many parts of our lives, and not just a seventh day of the week. If those rhythms of reverence and holiness lead to rest, what rest have you guys found in your life? What type of delighting in the Lord has come out of creating spaces and places for reverence for the King or reverence for his kingdom?
Me.
Hey.
Hi. My name's Collin. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who struggles. That's a great question. That's why there was silence for a sec. We're kind of on the other side of the Rollins, which is kind of fun. So we're after Saturday night into Sunday. That's how my family and a few things too. It was always communal, and it was always involved in creation. Like throughout the scriptures, this rest, this idea. We were talking a little bit about how to pronounce Hebrew phrases before we started. You know, you have Shabbat, which is that term for rest, delight, stop, cease. But then in Genesis, you continue, and there's another phrase, which is nuach, that God placed him like in a place, and that's the same place we use for dwelling. So that idea of rest and dwelling. And so there's the communal, the relational aspect of one with God, but as well as with one another. And so I think this idea that it's like me and God, and we don't have to see anybody all day. Jesus actually, in Matthew, which you mentioned, it seems like that's Jesus when he talks about the Sabbath, that's not the heart of it. It is not to, if love God and love neighbor are the priorities as followers of Jesus, it seems like then our practice of Sabbath takes a backseat, you know? So I can't like see someone on the street or in need or seeing someone in a crisis and be like, sorry, I'm reading my Kindle and me and my kids are at the pool playing and praying.
Got no time for you.
No, I think that we miss out on it. But for us, it really was. And Daniel and Kristen George, two of our community group leaders, have been huge in showing us this of one stopping, having a time and a space where there's just this to stop, doing that together, and then really delighting in God. What are things we can do together that are worshipful, and less of the legalistic kind of. Actually, my son and I had a conversation just this past Sunday. So for me, it's like come home from Saturday nights, turn off the phone. Like if I'm on my phone, I'm working. I don't chill on my phone. If I do, I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and even that's usually work because it's like stuff about this, and I'm like, I'm gonna watch a 2-hour lecture about the Hebrew words. And so
You're a nerd.
oh, stop it. But so I turn off phone. Aaron and I, we put it in a drawer. We actually have a sacred space in place for our devices. And then throughout the day, it's a lot of lo-fi and reading. We read a lot of books. We listen to good music. We go on walks, bike rides, we pray. And then we usually try to invite other people into that space, again, to join us. Not because it's ministry, but it's like we long to do this with one another. And so Beckham, I got an e-reader recently, which is great if you don't have an e-reader, but it's so much better than carrying all the books. And my son asked if, hey, you get your tablet. Why can't I have my tablet? And I was like, well, technically this is an e-reader, the book. And he, my sweet Pharisaical child, was like, has a screen. And so
he's not wrong,
but I'm reading books. It doesn't have apps anyway. And I'm reading books about Jesus. Come on, Beckham. I'm sorry, son. I shouldn't shame you on the internet. Kyle, please cut that. So for us, it really has become this day set aside for delight and rest and enjoyment and running and taking care of our bodies and our minds and creation with one another so that we can enter a new week together with Jesus. From that posture. And I think even with the Hebrews piece, the author of Hebrews talks about let us strive to enter that rest, Hebrews 4:10. That what is that rest? And then you come back to Jesus in Matthew 11 where he says, come to me, all you who are heavy, weary, laden, take my yoke upon you and I will give you rest. And so somehow Jesus is at the center of all of this. From the creation narrative throughout the Old Testament laws. I mean, every single piece of it points to him. So I think when we begin to lose sight of this is an opportunity to not just like physical rest, but to remind myself of the eternal rest that I have because of what God has done. So I'm going to strive. I'm going to create that time and create that space to remind myself of the Shabbat and the Nuach, the rest and the dwelling place that I have because of what Jesus invites me into.
You said the eternal rest. I think that's kind of got to be it a little bit. I mean, we have to live in this life, in this world for the kingdom, thinking about the things that God has promised in light of eternity. You mentioned that eternal rest. Nick mentioned the story of Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. You don't need to worship on the mountain. There will be a time when you will be able to worship in spirit and in truth. I think in my life, there are moments, kind of like what you're talking about, Nick, carving away, spaces all throughout our life for intimacy with the Lord and connection with the Spirit and places of reverence for His holiness. There's places and spaces all the time for me where I can recognize the eternal rest that I experience here and now and that God has promised for me, and have the joy of being able to do that because by His Spirit I can worship and know Him right here and right now in this place. Yeah. I mean, I often will turn my music off in my car, roll the window down, and simply just exist and be and think to myself about how I'm doing this because I'm a follower of Jesus. And it's not like it's a holy act to not listen to music. A lot of people listen to music in the car because they love Jesus, and that's a good place to worship Him with some music that makes them think about Him. But I'll often just create silence for myself in the car and enjoy that because it's a good place to be with the Lord. Yeah. I'll often go on a run. I'll actively do something. I'll create space to go run and sweat and go around Lake Atlanta a couple times until I get tired, because it just feels so genuinely like a space that I can give the Lord and experience life with Him. I feel Him running with me in a way that if I'm on the couch just watching a show that I like, the Lord's with me there, of course. But there's something about going out on a run that I feel like, man, I'm just doing this with the Lord, and I feel his presence here, and I feel like I can commune with Him and confess things and ask Him hard questions. And so for me, there's spaces and places that I really genuinely experience a reverence for the Lord's holiness and a reminder of that rest whenever I give Him those spaces. And for a lot of other people, it might look very different.
I think what you said there is really insightful, and probably the best place for us to wrap it up is that you become aware of His presence. It's not that He's not there, but what all of these rhythms are doing, I think, is helping to unclutter space and time and our minds and our lives so that we can become aware of God's presence with us and connect with Him in a meaningful way. And that's what this discussion of Sabbath is really all about. So I hope that as a congregation, as a people walking with the Lord, that we can do that we can create space to become aware of the God who is always with us so that we can connect with Him and be conformed to be more like Him. Collin, Scott, thanks for this great discussion, and thanks all of you for listening to Footnotes. Have a great week.
E-readers are different than tablets.
That is the other thing that we should end on.
Pray for me.